Avery Williams blended into the background of the Metatran logistics office like a brushstroke in a neutral painting, noticeable only to those who cared enough to really look. At 26, she carried herself with quiet elegance, her posture straight, her voice low, her movements precise. She wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention with flashy clothes or loud opinions. Her style was simple but neat. A soft ivory blouse, a faded gray skirt that always ended just below the knee, flats worn in at the heels. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled into a loose, practical bun, and her face, though youthful, had the calm stillness of someone who had learned to listen long before she ever spoke. She worked as a procurement assistant in the supply division of one of the largest medical logistics corporations on the West Coast. Her desk sat near the window nobody liked because it let in too much afternoon glare. She didn't mind. It gave her light and she worked better with sunlight. Her desk was meticulously organized. Everything she touched, from vendor contracts to last-minute purchase orders, was handled with the kind of invisible competence that made other people's jobs easier, without them ever realizing why. She didn't socialize much, not because she didn't know how, but because she understood when not to interrupt. She was the kind of employee bosses forgot to praise because she gave them no problems. Savannah Pierce, the department manager, had the opposite energy. She walked fast, talked faster, and dressed like she was always heading to a networking event. Savannah was sharp, young, charismatic, and careful to surround herself with people who reinforced her authority. Her leadership style relied on speed, confidence, and the kind of surface brilliance that looked good in executive summaries. She often spoke over people, especially Avery. Not cruelly, just habitually, as if Avery's quiet voice didn't register on her radar. Savannah never saw her as a threat, just someone dependable enough to pile extra work on. The morning started like any other. The office hummed with casual chatter and keyboard clicks. Savannah hadn't arrived yet, but the weekly procurement meeting had to start. Rather than let the team sit idle, Avery quietly walked to the front of the room, handed out reports, opened the shared spreadsheet, and began reviewing updates. She did not raise her voice. She didn't try to impress. She simply explained what needed to be said. The room responded to her calm clarity with rare attentiveness. People asked questions. She gave precise answers. There was no performance, just work. And then, halfway through a discussion about vendor rate discrepancies, Savannah entered. She stood still in the doorway, one hand still on the handle, her eyes scanning the scene in front of her. Avery at the front, the team focused, no chaos. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She crossed the room slowly and sat down, expression unreadable. Avery finished her sentence, met Savannah's gaze for the briefest second, then stepped aside without needing an invitation. The shift in the room was subtle, but it happened. Something about it stuck, like the faint scent of smoke in a quiet room. The atmosphere in the office that afternoon felt different in a way no one could name out loud. There hadn't been an announcement, no policy change, no email from corporate, but something had shifted. Savannah Pierce, usually so quick with her words, had spent the rest of the morning in unusual silence, responding to questions with tight nods and brisk phrases, her focus visibly unsettled. She hadn't acknowledged Avery, not once, not even with a glance, as if pretending she hadn't witnessed the earlier meeting might erase the image of her team, listening attentively to someone else. There was a tension to her movements now, a strain in her shoulders when she walked past the cluster of desks where Avery sat back at her station, typing steadily, head slightly bowed, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Avery didn't act like anything had changed. She didn't boast. She didn't smile knowingly. She simply returned to her work, her gaze moving calmly from document to screen to printout, like she always did. By early afternoon, Savannah had begun pacing. She moved between her office and the printer, between the break room and the glass-walled conference room, carrying her phone in one hand and a highlighter in the other, as if both might help her find a sense of control she couldn't quite locate. Her footsteps were sharper than usual. Staff looked up from their screens as she passed, then quickly looked back down. Everyone felt the edge in the air, even if they didn't understand what caused it. At 2:43, Savannah sent a calendar invite to Avery. Quick sync. Conf room 3B. No message, no subject. Just the kind of clinical appointment marker that meant nothing and yet said everything. Avery saw it pop up on her screen and quietly clicked accept. The hallway to conference room 3B was empty. The room itself was cold, the air conditioning just slightly too strong, the long glass table freshly wiped, the city skyline dimming through tinted windows. Savannah was already inside, arms crossed, one finger tapping lightly against her elbow. She didn't sit. Avery entered without hesitation and stood just a few steps in, her posture as composed as ever, though her hands folded loosely in front of her instead of at her sides. Savannah didn't say hello. She tilted her head slightly and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry across the room. "You know," she began, "I've noticed a pattern with women like you." Her tone was smooth but edged. You come in quiet, humble. You keep your head down, make yourself useful. But eventually you get ideas. You think a few spreadsheets and late nights mean you're entitled to something. Avery didn't interrupt. Her expression didn't shift. Savannah stepped closer. What you did this morning was unacceptable. You don't speak for this department. You don't lead meetings. You don't answer questions directed at me. That's not your place. I didn't intend to overstep, Avery replied softly, her voice calm. I started the meeting because it was already 10 minutes behind and the team needed the figures. Oh, how noble, Savannah cut in, voice rising slightly. You decided what the team needed? Did they ask you to lead? Did they nominate you? She gave a short, bitter laugh. No, you just couldn't resist. You saw a moment and took it. Avery took a breath, not defensive, just steady. I did what I believed would keep things moving. Nothing more. Don't play innocent, Savannah snapped. You've been pushing boundaries for months. The little notes in the margin, the corrections you slip into reports, I've seen it. I've let it go. But now you're making me look incompetent in front of my own team? Avery hesitated only a second. That wasn't my goal. Savannah's eyes narrowed. But that was the result. And in this company, optics matter more than intentions. She circled to the other side of the table, placing both hands flat on the glass. So, I'll make this very simple for you. You're done here. Pack up your desk. Security will walk you out by end of day. There was no shout, no slammed door. Just a firm, final declaration, cold as the glass it bounced off. For a moment, the room stood still, the fluorescent lights above flickering faintly, the silence stretching like a held breath. Avery didn't protest. She didn't cry. She looked directly at Savannah, her face unreadable, her jaw slightly set, as if absorbing every word and tucking it away. Not for revenge, but for record. She gave the smallest of nods, turned, and left the room without another word. By the time she returned to her desk, the entire office knew something had happened, even if no one had heard what. Her inbox had already been locked, her keycard access revoked. She opened her bottom drawer, took out a small box she kept for personal belongings, and began placing items inside. A notebook, a coffee mug with her initials, a paperweight shaped like an ammonite shell. One of the junior staffers, Sienna, barely out of college, approached slowly, eyes wide and hesitant, but Avery gave her a faint smile that stopped her in her tracks. There was no anger in her expression, only clarity. When she reached the final item, a slim manila folder, she paused. It had no name on it, just a handwritten phrase in blue ink. For those who actually look. She slid it into her bag, and then she left, quietly, steadily, heels tapping down the corridor like punctuation marks at the end of a chapter. No speech, no drama. Just a departure so calm it made everyone who watched it feel somehow smaller. No one laughed, no one clapped. A few looked away. A few watched her until she was gone, suddenly unsure of the story they had been telling themselves about who she was. Outside the Metatran building, the city moved as it always did. Buses groaning against intersections, crosswalk lights blinking, shoes scuffing over concrete. All of it unaware of what had just happened inside. Avery stepped out into the air with her small box clutched to her side, her long coat drawn against the late afternoon chill. She didn't pause on the steps or look back at the towering glass structure behind her. There was no slow turn, no wistful gaze. Just a single composed stride forward as she merged into the sidewalk flow, disappearing among the crowd like a ripple swallowed by current. Her departure left behind not just an empty chair and a blinking monitor, but an uneasy silence that clung to the office like dust unsettled in the light. No one knew what to say. Not because they didn't feel something, but because they weren't ready to admit that they had witnessed something wrong and done nothing. Savannah returned to her office without a word. Her door closed with an audible click that sounded sharper than it should have, and for the rest of the day she remained out of sight. People resumed work, but only mechanically. Conversations were clipped. Screens were stared at longer than needed. There was a heaviness now, the kind that settles when someone who made everything work quietly slips away. Tasks Avery had handled automatically were now awkwardly redistributed. The latest supply audit, due in 2 days, had no owner. The new vendor intake form Savannah was supposed to finalize had been left unreviewed in the system. But no one dared bring it up. It was only Josh, a quiet analyst who worked 3 rows down, who dared to open his mouth before the day ended. He approached Savannah's office with hesitant steps, lightly tapped once, then pushed the door open without waiting. She looked up from her phone, her expression as carefully arranged as a staged photo. And before he could speak, she raised one hand. "I don't want to hear it," she said. "If this is about Avery, save it. I've already spoken to HR. The paperwork is filed." Josh hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I just think..." She held a lot together. There's stuff she didn't even talk about that she just did. It might be worth reconsidering, or at least making a plan for who... "She got too comfortable," Savannah snapped, her tone low and sharp. "This is a professional environment, not a mentorship program. She crossed a line and there are consequences. End of story." Josh nodded, almost involuntarily, and retreated with a murmur that sounded like apology, though he didn't know for whom. That evening, the office dimmed slowly as the sun slipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows over silent desks. A few employees lingered, scrolling screens not from necessity but unease. Something didn't sit right. The absence was louder than the presence had ever been. Across town, in a quiet walk-up apartment just off Broadway, Avery sat at her small kitchen table, her coat still on, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't touched. The box of belongings rested unopened beside her. The light from the window glowed gold over the pages of her notebook, open but blank. She stared at it, not in defeat, but in reflection. There was no need to call anyone, no need to vent. This was not the first time her steadiness had been mistaken for ambition, her precision for threat. It had happened before, though not as publicly, and not with such surgical cruelty. But this time, she felt something she hadn't felt in past betrayals. Certainty. Not anger, not shame, but the undeniable weight of being right. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder marked, "For those who actually look." Inside was more than spreadsheets. It was a full structural redesign of the department's vendor pipeline. Her proposal for integrating AI auditing into inventory tracking, ideas she had developed quietly over the past 6 months, working late after hours while others left early to beat. Traffic. She had shown it once, months ago, in rough form. Savannah had dismissed it with a comment about not needing bells and whistles. But Avery had kept working, refining, polishing, not for approval, for integrity. Now she looked at it with new eyes, not as a suggestion, but as a statement. She made a small edit with a pen, then another. Then she added a short note at the front, unsigned. She slipped the revised packet into a new envelope, sealed it, and placed it in the outbox near her door, addressed not to HR, not to Savannah, but to the office of the Chief Operations Officer, Thomas Rain. The next morning, back at Metatran, the absence of Avery had turned from a silent discomfort into logistical chaos. The ordering system returned errors. The vendor on file for a key shipment claimed they'd never received a PO. The audit review was flagged for missing documentation. A few staff scrambled to find a process map, something Avery had apparently kept on her own computer, never digitized, never copied. Not out of secrecy. Simply because no one had ever asked. Savannah held a tense 10 a.m. huddle during which she insisted everything was under control. Her voice was firmer than usual, her tone clipped, eyes scanning the room for resistance. But the faces that met her gaze were not confident. They were wary. She dismissed the team with a brittle smile and returned to her office, where she spent the next half hour clicking through systems she barely understood, trying to trace a paper trail that didn't exist. At precisely 11:12 a.m., an alert pinged her screen. A new message from the COO's office. The subject line, "Review this now." She clicked it open. Attached was Avery's packet. Savannah read the first page and her stomach tightened. It wasn't just a process improvement plan, it was a strategic roadmap, one that aligned directly with the company's Q4 objectives, one that addressed problems senior leadership had been quietly circling for months. And at the bottom of the first page was a line she hadn't seen before. Submitted anonymously for consideration without prejudice. Savannah read it again, then again. Her jaw clenched. In the open office, no one knew what was happening, but they felt it. Like thunder far off, waiting for the moment it would break. The next day began without ceremony. Morning settled into the office with its usual rhythm. Elevator chimes, the scent of burnt coffee, the tap of keyboards waking from sleep. But underneath the normalcy was a growing sense of something approaching. The air felt denser somehow, as if people were waiting for something they couldn't name. Savannah walked through the office in an unusually quiet mood. Her stride lacked its usual flair, and the sharp sound of her heels was softened by hesitation. Her hair was tied tighter than usual, her blazer newly pressed, her expression unreadable but brittle at the edges. She wasn't holding her phone as she usually did, and she didn't stop by anyone's desk to make small talk or give instructions. She simply went straight into her office, closed the door with a soft but definitive click, and stayed there. From behind the glass wall, staff could see her on calls, shuffling papers, sometimes just sitting completely still, staring at something none of them could see. In the break room, murmurs grew. The procurement team had spent the morning trying to fix the chaos left in the wake of Avery's absence. Everyone had their theories about why the system was unraveling so quickly. Some believed Avery had taken something with her out of spite. Others, more honest with themselves, began to realize they had never understood just how much she was doing, because she never made a show of it. That was part of the discomfort now, knowing someone had been quietly holding things together, only for the rest of them to discover it after she was gone. There was no replacing her, not because her role was unique, but because her care had been. Around noon, the real disruption arrived. Not an announcement, not an emergency, but a visit. Thomas Rain, the chief operations officer, stepped onto the floor without a word. He was taller than most had imagined, in a navy suit with no tie, his presence calm and still, but cutting through the office noise like a cold breeze. He didn't bring assistance. He didn't check his watch. He simply walked in, nodded to the receptionist, and headed toward the central bullpen without introducing himself. Eyes followed him. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. He had never visited this floor before. Everyone knew him by name, of course, from quarterly video addresses and executive updates, but few had ever seen him in person. Even fewer had ever heard him speak directly to staff. He didn't ask to see Savannah right away. Instead, he stopped at Josh's desk. The quiet analyst blinked in disbelief when the COO greeted him by name. "I read your report on vendor redundancies," Thomas said calmly. "Well structured, too cautious maybe, but thoughtful." Josh nodded, stunned into silence. Thomas gave him a brief smile, then walked further into the room, stopping occasionally to look at walls, whiteboards, open files. He said very little. His presence wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It wasn't until 20 minutes later that he finally stepped into Savannah's office. No one heard what was said. The blinds were drawn. But the moment the door closed, a new silence took hold. No one dared speak. Time seemed to slow. Inside, Savannah stood, arms crossed, but her posture gave her away. Her shoulders were rigid, her jaw tense. Thomas remained seated, legs crossed, fingers gently steepled, not aggressive but firmly planted. On the desk between them lay a printed version of the proposal Avery had submitted. It was annotated, marked up in clean blue pen. Some lines were underlined, others circled. A large check mark sat in the top right corner of the first page. Savannah stared at it like it was a verdict. "She submitted this anonymously," she said finally, her voice lower than usual. "That should say something about her character." "It does," Thomas replied without missing a beat. "It says she wasn't trying to climb. She was trying to contribute. She didn't need her name on it. She needed the solution to be seen." Savannah swallowed but said nothing. Her eyes darted toward the window, though she could no longer see the office floor through the closed blinds. You let her go without a conversation. No HR involvement, no review, Thomas continued. You escalated over a perceived threat, not a real violation. She took over my meeting, Savannah replied quickly. She acted like someone who saw something broken and tried to keep it moving, he interrupted. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. And that scares people like you. People who confuse leadership with volume. Savannah stiffened. She's not qualified to run a team. She barely talks to people. She doesn't even have senior certification. She doesn't need to, he said. She already leads. There was no drama in his voice, no vindictiveness. Just the simple weight of a conclusion already reached. The conversation ended not with a threat, but with a pause that said more than any warning. He stood, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and added quietly before opening the door, I'll be calling her this afternoon. Don't try to contact her again. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him. The silence in the office had shifted. It was no longer the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the quiet that follows a subtle realignment. When everyone suddenly realizes they've been watching the wrong person all along, eyes didn't turn toward Savannah's door anymore. They turned inward, backward, toward memories of a girl who had spoken softly, who had arrived early, stayed late, answered questions no one else could answer, not because she wanted to impress, but because someone had to. The kind of person easy to overlook until you needed her. And now, as they sat at their desks and checked their systems, they realized the one person they had failed to recognize was the one person the company had now chosen to trust. The morning after Thomas Raine's unannounced visit began with a tremor, subtle but unmistakable, felt not in the floorboards but in the pacing of footsteps, the tone of emails, the strained glances exchanged across rows of open desks. The staff at Metatran Logistics came in earlier than usual, sensing a shift in gravity they could neither name nor avoid. A current ran through the office, not quite fear, but not quite anticipation either. Something heavier, the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. Savannah's office door remained closed. No lights on, no motion inside. Her usual presence, the brisk clicks of heels, the sharp tap of her nails on glass, was absent. Some assumed she was in meetings. Others whispered she had been asked to stay home. No one dared to ask directly. Even those who had followed her lead for months found themselves unsure of which direction was forward now. Without her to orbit around, the room drifted. Questions hung in the air unanswered. Reports went unapproved and tasks piled without resolution. What had once been mistaken for structure now revealed itself to be held up by habit. And behind that habit, one woman whose name no one had the courage to mention aloud just yet. Just before noon, the elevator opened with a low chime. A man in a dark, understated suit stepped out. Not Thomas Raine this time, but someone the staff had only seen on the company website. Marcus Fields, Chief Human Resources Officer. His appearance turned heads instantly. He did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He held a thin leather folder in his hand and walked with a pace so deliberate it turned every keyboard quiet. Without hesitation, he made his way to the center of the floor and addressed the nearest cluster of desks. Would someone kindly point me to Joshua Keller? Josh stood slowly, surprise written across his face. That's me. Marcus nodded once. Come with me, please. They disappeared into one of the smaller conference rooms. Blinds were drawn. Again, no one could hear what was said. Again, no one returned to work. Everyone was watching now, breathing shallower, pretending not to speculate. 20 minutes passed. Then the door opened and Josh emerged. He didn't speak. His face was unreadable. But he walked not back to his desk, but toward the elevator, where he pressed the button, hands steady. The door opened, and from inside, stepping out like a figure from memory, was Avery Williams. Her presence did not announce itself. She didn't stride. She didn't smile. She stepped forward with the same quiet posture that had once gone unnoticed here every day. Her coat was folded neatly over her arm, her blouse soft blue beneath a charcoal cardigan, her hair pulled back. Not into a bun this time, but into a low ponytail that hung over her shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room once. She met no one's gaze and challenge, but she also didn't look away. She simply acknowledged the space with a stillness that no one could quite look away from. Marcus walked beside her. As they crossed the floor, people began to rise from their desks without meaning to. Not out of duty. Out of something more instinctive. Josh stood waiting by the doorway to conference room A, and Marcus gestured for Avery to enter first. She did. The door closed behind them. From that room, things moved quickly. Within the hour, a company-wide email was sent. It was brief. It carried the subject line, Personnel and Departmental Realignment, effective immediately. It began with the expected phrases, after careful review, and with the intention of strengthening leadership integrity. But one line in particular caused a hush to fall across hundreds of employees, across 4 floors of Metatrans headquarters. Effective this week, Avery Williams will serve as Interim Director of Procurement Strategy for West Division, reporting directly to the office of the COO. There were no photos, no commentary, just a name, a title, and a quiet replacement. But inside the office where the upheaval had started, the meaning struck harder than any announcement ever could. At Savannah's former desk, her inbox was disabled. Her nameplate had been removed. And in its place, not a flourish of celebration, but a single line in Avery's careful handwriting on the whiteboard beside the door. Let the work speak before you do. The weight of that sentence lingered all day. Still, not everyone was ready to accept the shift. Behind closed doors in an adjacent department, a cluster of middle managers gathered over coffee and resentment. Some complained quietly about optics and narrative control, unable to grasp how someone they had always viewed as support staff could be handed so much trust. One of them, Miriam Clark, folded her arms and said, "She won the room because she lost it first. Don't you see how this works now? It's all about who gets humiliated loudest." But even those words rang hollow because everyone in that building knew what they'd seen. A woman fired in public without raising her voice. A woman who walked out with her head up and returned not with vengeance, but with clarity. She hadn't shamed anyone. She hadn't exposed secrets. She had simply kept the records, drawn the maps, and waited until someone finally noticed the roads she had built under everyone's feet. Late that afternoon, as the sun passed low behind the west windows, Avery stepped out of the conference room for the first time since morning. She didn't go to Savannah's old desk. She stopped beside the shared printer, checked a stack of drafts, corrected a mislabeled item, and moved on. Her movements were as quiet as ever, but the office was no longer. Everywhere she went, people turned, greeted her, not loudly, not dramatically, but with respect. Not because of her title, but because the hierarchy had been reset not from the top down, but from the inside out. And perhaps the most telling moment came not from a statement, but from an action. The last file she reviewed before leaving that day bore a name she hadn't seen in months. A small vendor from Tacoma that she'd fought to retain, one whose invoices had always been just slightly off format, just enough to irritate Savannah, who had nearly cut them loose. Avery had revised the protocol herself to accommodate their formatting, knowing the quality of their work was worth the effort. Now, as she signed her approval, she left a handwritten note in the margin for the billing team. Maintain direct communication. They matter. That was how she operated. Not with ceremony, not with headlines, but with decisions that added up quietly until they could no longer be ignored. 2 days later, Metatron's quarterly regional review began in the top-floor conference suite, a glass-walled space usually reserved for directors and visiting executives. It was the kind of gathering where titles outnumbered participants, and where every seat, every chart, every word was chosen for its strategic weight. The energy was exacting, controlled, curated, efficient. But this time, the rhythm was unfamiliar. Several department heads had been quietly reshuffled since last quarter, and some now sat with stiff backs and uncertain expressions, while others stole glances at the chair placed third from the right, still unclaimed. A new name had appeared on the printed agenda beside it. Avery Williams, Interim Director, Procurement Strategy. At exactly 9:58 a.m., the elevator chimed. Avery entered. No assistants, no entourage. She walked in alone, holding a slim binder in her hand. Her navy dress was modest, crisp at the cuffs, paired with soft brown flats. She greeted the room with a polite nod, her voice calm as she said good morning. There were no flourishes, no speeches. She took her seat, opened her binder, and waited. The conversation resumed, but the attention in the room subtly recalibrated itself around her. Not everyone could articulate why. She was young, she was new, but there was something undeniable about her composure. Quiet but firm. The weight of someone who had stood through a storm and hadn't once raised her voice to compete with the thunder. When it was her turn to speak, she began not with data, but with a question. How many vendors have we lost in the last year due to miscommunication? The room stirred. A few department heads shifted uncomfortably. According to finance, it's 14. 7 of them were small regional partners, each with less than a dozen employees. Their departure didn't shake our numbers, but it did increase emergency shipping costs by 36% across 3 zones. The loss wasn't loud, it was quiet. But it's still a loss. She paused, let the silence grow, then continued. I've outlined a revised protocol that shortens the approval cycle for non-standard invoices. It includes human review at the early stage because not everything should be reduced to automation. Some vendors don't fit our system. That doesn't mean they don't belong. No one interrupted her. One of the senior logistics officers leaned forward slightly, studying the graphs she had distributed. Another scratched something into his notepad. Across the table, the director of operations for the southern region gave a small nod. Not of courtesy, but of recognition. Then Thomas Rain spoke. Until now, he had remained silent, arms crossed, listening. He looked at Avery, his gaze steady. What was the total cost of retaining the 7 vendors through adjustments? Avery flipped a page. Approximately $42,000 per quarter, compared to a 1-year increase of over $400,000 in Rush Logistics since their contracts were terminated. He smiled faintly. Efficient math, but that's not why I asked you to speak today. The room turned. I asked Avery to join us not just because her systems work, but because her leadership works. Leadership doesn't start with authority. It starts with listening, with accountability, with showing up even after you've been told to leave. The words landed with a weight no graph could carry. No one looked directly at Avery, but the air around her had shifted once more. She didn't thank him. She didn't blush. She simply closed her binder and waited for the meeting to continue. At the close of the review, as executives filed out, a few lingered near her. A handshake. A quiet, impressive. A request for a copy of her presentation. But the moment that would linger came as she exited the room. Thomas walked beside her for a few steps, then stopped just before the elevator. He didn't offer a speech, only a gesture. His hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. Then a simple phrase spoken low enough for only her to hear. You didn't win because you were louder. You won because you never lied about who you are. And with that, the elevator doors opened. She stepped in, alone again, not elevated by title or power, but by the kind of dignity no one could ever fire. The following week settled over the office, not with noise, but with a kind of clarity. Routines resumed, but they sounded different now. Footsteps more measured, conversations less performative. Small silences that once felt empty now filled with thought. The seat at the corner desk that once belonged to Avery remained vacant for 2 full days, even after her new office had been assigned on the upper floor. No one sat there. No one touched her chair. It wasn't out of reverence. It was something more personal, almost private, as though the space itself needed time to exhale. Papers that had once passed through her hands came back with notes in new handwriting, but something in the margins always felt missing. The transitions were smooth, but they weren't seamless. That difference lingered. On Thursday morning, a small card appeared beside the coffee machine, taped gently to the cabinet. No signature, no announcement. Just 6 handwritten words in blue ink. Pay attention to what feels quiet. Some recognized the handwriting immediately. Others only felt its meaning. There was no discussion about who had written it. It didn't need explanation. It just stayed there, untouched, as if no one wanted to be the first to move it. Meanwhile, Avery's new role unfolded with the same steadiness she had always carried. She didn't issue bold memos. She didn't rearrange departments or install new processes overnight. She walked the floors with the same calm pace, occasionally stopping to ask a single question that others had overlooked. She sat in on meetings, listening more than she spoke, only leaning forward when something truly needed to be said. She delegated rarely, but always precisely, and she asked for input from those who had never been asked before. On a rainy Friday afternoon, as the office lights reflected against water-slicked windows, one of the interns, a girl named Lily, barely 20, new to the chaos of adult work, stood in the hallway near the elevator and watched Avery pause to tie a loose shoelace, her umbrella hanging from one wrist. The girl spoke without thinking. "How did you do it?" she asked, not expecting a reply. Avery stood up slowly and glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Lily hesitated. "How did you survive here, when no one saw what you were doing?" Avery smiled, not proudly, not sadly, just softly. "I saw it, that was enough, until someone else did." And with that, she stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind her as gently as everything else she ever touched. No thunder, no spotlight, just truth walking forward.